Thanks, Sherilyn. Can you give me a thumbs up, Sherilyn, if you can hear me? All right, good. We've passed the first obstacle. Sorry, I'm very bright over here. It's kind of the only light I have in the room, and when you're going bald, it seems to reflect even more. But we'll get through this. So thank you, Sherilyn, for the introduction. I always feel like when people say I'm an expert and know everything, that people are bound to be very disappointed by the end of the presentation, but I'll do the best that I can. So currently I direct the network's program that's called Combating White Nationalism and Defending Democracy. And I was looking through the attendees and I see a lot of names of longtime MHRN members and supporters that I know well, that they probably know me well. I see some new names as well. I have worked for MHRN. This is actually my second stint with the organization, but for a total of about 17 years. So when Sherilyn and I initially came up with this presentation, and I think I'll go ahead and go into my share screen mode here. So just give me 1 second. Okay. Oh, there we go. Okay. So when we initially came up with the title for this presentation, it was months ago. And so initially it was called What to Do When White Nationalists Target Your Community. And we decided to switch it up just a little bit. And that was due to the fact that, as you're all aware, quite a bit has happened in the last, month or so. And here in Montana, we've seen lots of armed militias showing up at anti-racist protests, Black Lives Matters protests, those types of events. And so we decided to actually focus quite a bit on that dynamic here today. But as you'll see, white nationalists and the militias have plenty of historical crossover. And as far as the responding piece goes, how white nationalists and the anti-government patriot movement, which the militia movement is part of, how they interact and impact communities are very similar between the two movements, and how communities can respond are also very similar. So maybe a little bit different than what you were expecting, but hopefully we'll still, you'll still get something out of it. So we're splitting this presentation up. I'm gonna start with background on the militia movement, some history, how we got to where we are now. And then I'll kick it back to Sherilyn, who's going to talk about really how communities are responding on the ground right now, sort of based on that knowledge that we've gained over the years. We would encourage people that at any point during this, if you have a question, to go ahead and type it into the Q&A function that if you hover down at the bottom of your screen will pop up. We actually won't really be using the chat a lot, so if you have a question, please put it in there. And then at the end, when I'm done and when Sherilyn's done, we will go back and answer your questions. All right, so what are we covering today? Since we're celebrating our 30th anniversary, it seemed like a good idea to take a little bit of time to look at MHRN's history. Surprise fact, I always include that, but for some reason it seems better because tonight we're having our 30th virtual anniversary party, or our 30th party virtually, however those words go together. So we'll look at militias, we'll look at the anti-government movement, which, as I said, the militia movement is really part of that broader anti-government patriot movement. I'll warn you right now, I'll be using militia and patriot pretty interchangeably during this presentation. So we'll look at that movement. We'll look at the movement as it started back in the 1990s and kind of track its progression up through the 2000s. And then we'll also look at how the public health measures that were taken around trying to stop the spread of COVID-19, which manifested themselves often as things called lockdown rallies, started this current mobilization of militia groups, and how that has ramped up in the last few weeks during the Black Lives Matters protests. We'll then turn it over to Sherilyn again, and she'll talk a little bit about the idea of understanding the militia playbook. So what game are they trying to play with us? What are they trying to get us to engage on? And really what the issues are and what we need to be thinking about. And then also she'll kind of cover how communities can resist militias and patriot groups. Now, one of the things I don't like about this format is I'm somebody that when I do these presentations in person, I tend to walk around a lot. So I apologize if you're getting a lot of this while I'm talking. Hopefully nobody gets seasick, but I know that's something that I do. And I want to warn you. So it's probably best to focus just on the slides. So first, a little bit about the Montana Human Rights Network. So we're a nonprofit group based out of Helena. We started back in 1990, hence the 30th anniversary party tonight. And when we formed, we really formed to be a fight the racist right group. We were formed by community groups who had started to notice a rise in activity in both white nationalism and anti-government groups, and we're really trying to fight back in their communities. But within a couple of years, we also really adopted a proactive policy agenda. And that has included everything from fighting for LGBTQ equality. I always like to say that we've been doing that before it was sexy. So we were fighting for LGBTQ equality back starting around in 1992 in Montana. But so that issue, immigrant rights, access to quality healthcare, reproductive freedom issues, the list goes on and on. Now, this interesting thing happened as we adopted this proactive work, and that was when you're out there fighting Nazis, everybody loves you. But in 1992, when we started working on LGBTQ rights and some of these other issues, people started to view us as controversial. As I mentioned, these local community groups came together to form us back in 1990. That affiliate model, those local groups are still a big piece of what we do. We currently have 8 formal affiliates. Many of those are based in specific communities, but then some of them are more statewide and based around certain policies. One of those groups is Love Lives Here. As Sherilyn mentioned, that's who she works with the most, and you'll hear a little bit more about later. And again, the way we think about the work that we do really has 3 big parts. So we do a lot of work in the public policy arena. We do a lot of work that's based around community organizing. And then we do a lot of what we call opposition research. And I think that, you know, one of the things that has made us unique, and I think is really one of the reasons that we have been around for 30 years, is that while we can separate those out into 3 bullet points, all of them work together. So our opposition research doesn't just sit around and we don't just public research reports. It impacts how we approach public policy work. It impacts how we do community organizing. What's happening in the public policy arena, what's happening on the ground in communities also informs the type of research that we're prioritizing at any given time. As you can probably tell, since the network's been around for 30 years, I've been here for 17. It's an organization that I think does important work and that I like a lot. Okay, I'm going to be providing a lot of names and details, and I don't want you to be worried that there's going to be a test at the end of this. The reason that we like to provide this type of background is so that you get an understanding of these movements and you have some context when you look out into your community and you see these things happening, you have some context to understand it. And so to that end, before I get in to what everyone at MHRN on the staff calls Travis nerding out on research, I wanted to give you a couple of frames that we use. So frames are just kind of simpler ways to think about very complex issues. And there's a lot of frames that we use, but I think that there's 2 that are really good in this context. So the first one is what we call margins to the mainstream. This is basically the idea of how does an idea that starts out at a militia meeting end up making its way to being proposed as possible public policy at the Montana legislature. Because of the scope of work that we do, which is basically from the state level down and the community level up, this is an issue that we have researched and talked about for decades. The second frame is this funnel cloud metaphor. And this one really gets at that idea of within movements and within groups, there are different levels of engagement. So at that very top end of the funnel cloud, the big end, you have people being pulled into these movements for all sorts of reasons, okay? Like for the Patriot movement, They really love their guns. They hate taxes. They don't think there should be, any kind of government regulations, all sorts of issues across the board. Now, a lot of people stay at that top end of engagement. And in fact, many of those people kind of spin around and then spin back out into what we would more consider mainstream conservatism. What's important to understand is that when those people spin back out, they take some of that political education, they take some of that ideology, they take those beliefs with them, and they take those into other activism that they do, which is part of the way that these ideas spread. But you have those people that start to work themselves down into the funnel cloud. Now, what happens as you start to go down in the funnel cloud? All of a sudden, these are folks that only start taking in information that really confirms and supports this emerging new worldview that they have. Now, people can kind of slide up and down in that funnel cloud, but if you have somebody who starts at the top, goes all the way through, and pops out that other end, those are the people that you have like Timothy McVeigh, the militia adherent that bombed the Oklahoma City federal building. Those are the people that have been totally indoctrinated and say, hey, our life, our society, our very civilization is at risk, and it's time to quit sitting around and talking and actually go out and do something. So I'd encourage you to kind of think of these, these two frames as we go forward. Okay, so the anti-government patriot movement is based on a hatred and distrust of the federal government, which these patriots justify through conspiracies that are largely based on anti-Semitism about these secret cabals that intend to subvert Americans to a shadowy one-world government. Now, in these conspiracies, the federal government is often in cahoots with other entities like the United Nations, and many patriots really believe that they will ultimately have to fight off an invasion by these supposed New World Order forces. Now, not surprisingly, people that become hardcore believers in this, it's not surprising to find out that a lot of them use threats of violence or actual violence to bully people in their communities and government officials. Now, much of this worldview involves these armed fantasies where militia members get to act out as these protectors of their communities who are going to fight off this invasion by outside forces. And when we get more to the current situation with Black Lives Matters and those protests, you'll see the same type of mindset by militia members coming up. So when I say patriots and we're talking about the overall patriot movement, we're talking about militia groups, we're talking about freeman groups, we're talking about sovereign citizen groups, we're talking about those types of groups, and many what I would call self-styled patriots. So people that may not really claim a group affiliation, but are absolutely following this ideology. And like I said, during this presentation, I'm probably going to use militia and patriot pretty interchangeably. So who are patriot groups? It includes historical examples like the Militia Montana and the Montana Freemen, up through current groups like the Oath Keepers, 3% Militias, and the Bundy family. Now, the Bundy family are what I'd like to call the Pied Piping family of armed standoffs with the federal government. They're the ones that led the armed standoffs both in Nevada and Oregon. Now, these patriot groups, they interact pretty easily with the political mainstream because they're talking about guns, they're talking about taxes, they're talking about property rights, and other issues that we, I think, all pretty much view as being part of the political mainstream. But one of the things that's really important to remember is where this movement originated. The patriot movement and the militia movement specifically, especially in the Pacific Northwest, really evolved out of the white nationalist movement. When you look at the framers and the architects of the militia movement of the 1990s, they came out of the hardcore white nationalist movement, and many of them followed a religion called Christian identity. So Christian identity is based on a racist and anti-Semitic interpretation of the Christian Bible. It teaches that Jews are the literal children of Satan, the people of color are subhuman mud people, and that the lost tribes of Israel actually migrated to Northern European white countries. So therefore, white people are God's chosen people. So this was the religion taught and practiced by Aryan nations, and again, many other groups here in the Pacific Northwest. So again, going back to some of the early framers and some of the very influential people in the militia movement, you find these connections to identity. A couple of those include John Trockman, who's pictured on the top of this slide, who was the founder of the Militia Montana, and his family were all identity adherents, and Trockman himself had spent time working with Aryan nations over in northern Idaho. Bo Greitz, who's the middle picture here, another very influential militia leader who was also an identity adherent. This list goes on and on and on and on. Now, what happened is these early framers made a conscious effort to create the militia movement in a way that downplayed racism and anti-Semitism to have more appeal in the mainstream. They recognized the limitations that exist, that, you know, frankly, racial slurs, blatant anti-Semitism, burning crosses on people's front lawn turns the vast majority of people off. So what they did was they sat down and they took these conspiracy theories, these anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that are core to the white nationalist movement, and they basically substituted out blatant anti-Semitism and blatant racism and added in guns and taxes. Okay, that's a little simplistic, but that's essentially what they did. So these one world government conspiracy theories of the white nationalist movement that centered around international Jews, now all of a sudden centered around international bankers and international elites. So what this means is the militia movement has racist and anti-Semitic roots. And you continue to see that when you look at that evolution of how the movement formed. So these early architects of the 90s movement, they took pieces. They took pieces from anti-Semitic and white nationalist groups like the Posse Comitatus and Aryan nations. As they were putting this together, you had the standoff at Ruby Ridge with the Randy Weaver family. Randy Weaver also spent time at Aryan nations, but where, because of the way that standoff went down, they were able to almost sort of test this message that they were coming up with, that you know what happens when the New World Order comes and one world government comes, the government will kill good patriots. So they were able to sort of test out some of these early messages during the Ruby Ridge standoff. And then following the Ruby Ridge standoff, so this would be kind of in late 92, you had a Christian identity pastor named Pete Peters convened, had basically a strategic meeting in Estes Park, where one of the pieces that came out of this was this idea to form militias and to keep this militia movement going forward as a way to mainstream white nationalism. So the militia movement has these racist and anti-Semitic roots, and it's really important, I think, for all of us to remember that current groups like the Oath Keepers, like the Three Percenters, and those types of groups grew from these same roots. But again, because the militia movement was started as a way to mainstream white nationalism, but to downplay those elements that most people find abhorrent, it has interacted very easily with the political mainstream over time. So again, I mentioned this idea of margins to the mainstream earlier. We have watched in Montana how bills around the New World Order black helicopters are proposed at the state legislature. We've seen bills that would have required all Montanans to be armed to serve in the unorganized militia or groups like the Militia of Montana. Over and over and over again, we've seen that. So the militia movement's connection to the political mainstream is very real. All right, let's do a very quick recap of sort of the 1990s up till now. So in the early 1990s, the militia movement, militia groups are going gangbusters. All across Montana in big communities and small communities, you had these organizing meetings taking place where you had hundreds and hundreds of people turning up to listen to people like John Trockman and then signing up to join militia groups. The first real big hit to that movement of the 90s came in 1995 when, as I mentioned earlier, Timothy McVeigh bombs the Oklahoma City building. And all of a sudden that happens, some of those more mainstream people that had been recruited in, again, think of that funnel cloud metaphor, people who had not gone down in the funnel cloud very far went and said, holy cow, I didn't know this was what I was signing up for, and kind of spun back out into the political mainstream. again, remembering that it wasn't like they just woke up and said, I'm done with all of that. They decided they didn't want to be affiliated with it, but some of those ideas they carried with them when they went back to more mainstream pursuits. Kind of the next big hit was Y2K. Some of you may remember, like, civilization was going to end. And a lot of the Patriot crowd bought hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of, 1-ton jars of dehydrated peanut butter and other goods. Well, when the civilization didn't end after Y2K, there were a lot of people that said, I'm out. So they left again, or, they lost more people. So by the time you get into the early 2000s, what you have is a movement that has lost some of those less hardcore members. At that point, you started to see nationally a lot of organizations start to say the militia movement is dead. Now, we out west and here in Montana, we said, wait a minute. It's dead if you're looking for it in the same places and in the same form as before. What we tracked, again, and talked about a lot and tried to get people to understand was that out west, which included here in Montana, some of those hardcore believers changed their groups' names. Some of them kept the same names. But what we saw those hardcore members and the leaders of those groups and the hardcore followers of those groups do is they started to gravitate and pivot towards land use fights. So again, when the rest of the country, to a certain extent, were so surprised with what happened with the Bundy family, we were like, that's where so much of the militia energy that was left in the early 2000s out west had started to gravitate. Okay, so then we're going to jump forward. We're going to jump forward to more around this time, or at least the current presidential administration. So national organizations have found over the years that the number of groups active in the Patriot movement suffer during Republican presidential administrations. And this makes sense because presidential administrations steal some of their recruiting thunder. So if you think about it, generally under those administrations, you see an expansion of gun rights, you see reductions in taxes, you see reducing, removing, rolling back regulations. And this most definitely proved to be true during the current administration. So it wasn't like there was no activity in this movement during the Trump administration, because out west, especially, you had all of these kind of flashpoints and fights going on around public lands and property rights issues. But the movement overall had sort of lost a little bit of its mojo. It had lost some of its tried and true recruiting issues and was sort of sitting there waiting for an opportunity. Then we have the COVID-19 pandemic and the shelter-in-place orders and the other measures designed to slow the spread of the virus. And in some ways, this ended up creating this perfect environment for militias and patriots. So what did you have? You have people who are scared and they're looking for information. And in many cases, they're online looking for information, and they're looking for information about the pandemic, they're about the virus, about how to survive. And they end up in these rabbit holes that sometimes lead to information put there purposely, misinformation, by anti-government patriots and white nationalists. But along with being scared, what you saw during these shelter-in-place orders as they continued is you started to see people start to get angry at the government, whether that was because businesses were still closed, whether it was because they had to wear masks, or many of these other measures taken to try to spread, to stop the spread of the virus. So these eventually morph into what became known as these lockdown rallies that happened all over the country, including here in Montana. And while, especially here in Montana, it wasn't necessarily that they were organized by militias, but you had members of these armed groups showing up at them. And again, perfect recruiting opportunity. You have crowds of scared, angry, largely in Montana, white conservatives protesting the government. And so this photo on this slide was taken at one of the rallies here in Montana. It shows Al Olszewski, who at the time was running for governor in the GOP primary, posing with members of the Yellowstone militia of Billings at one of the rallies in Helena. And I think one point I wanted to make here, I think it's important that it's amazing how often photos like these show up of Republicans holding office, showing up at these meetings. And I think it's important that to remember that it doesn't always mean that the official that's shown follows or believes these groups. I think the takeaway is that they view these militia groups, they view these armed folks as part of their political base. So it may not even be that they agree, but too many office holders don't think that there's a downside, again, to being pictured with armed folks at a public event. So there's this building and mobilizing happening during the pandemic. Then we have the murder of George Floyd, and you start to have these anti-racist protests, these Black Lives Matters protests all around the country, including here in Montana. Now, probably no matter where you live, but if you live here in Montana, you probably started to notice these pictures popping up that show these armed militia groups at these protests. And you probably found yourself wondering, like, how and why did this happen? And a major piece of it is something that we dubbed the Antifa fantasy. Now, versions of this fantasy and this template showed up all over the country. The basic concept was there are these caravans of Antifa members that are coming from out of state that are going to infiltrate these local protests and cause looting and rioting. Now, the person who brought this to Montana, brought this fantasy to Montana, was State Senator Jennifer Fielder, who posted what's on the slide here, basically late on a Monday night, and it spread like wildfire through militia and patriot social media groups. And it had the additional legitimacy of coming from an elected official. So within a couple hours the next day, we had determined there was no caravan. And this was confirmed by people in law enforcement at every level and was reinforced by statements from mayors and other elected officials at the local level. But as the great Ken Toole of MHRN used to say in these situations, facts don't matter. And that was really true when you got into militia social media, where it was just on fire. It was on fire with people so excited to pull out their guns, pull out their tactical gear, and get ready to shoot some of these imaginary Antifa protesters. So the Antifa hunting permit that's on this slide down on the bottom left, that's actually what one of the leaders of the Yellowstone Militia of Billings changed his Facebook profile picture to, kind of right around this time. So the morning after the post by Fielder, all of the discussion, well, I shouldn't say all, but we're talking, 99% of the discussion is focused around patriots and militia members so excited that they're going to get a chance to get their tactical gear together, go out and basically live out one of these armed conflict fantasies at their local Black Lives Matters rally. Again, like I mentioned earlier, that fits with those conspiracy theories where the militia members see themselves as the protectors of the community fighting off these outside forces. In this case, the outside forces weren't the United Nations, but instead these Antifa protesters. Well, I have a feeling, and you start to see this shift early that afternoon, where I think some of the militia leaders were like, boy, the fact that all we're talking about is showing up at these public events and shooting people might not portray us in the best light. So you start to see this shift in the narrative and the talking points that they were using, where they turn from, we're showing up to shoot people, to, hey, we're just good God-fearing people who are going to show up and we're going to protect and provide security for the protesters. And that's really the message that they continue to use today. And show up they did. Pretty much every anti-racist protest in Montana over that 2.5 week period had militia members showing up. And the groups were varied. So on the left there, you have somebody sporting what you could almost call the uniform of the Boogaloo movement, or he's a boogie boy. And this is a kind of a subset of the militia movement. They're sick of kind of sitting around waiting for martial law to be declared and waiting for there to be war. They want to go out and start the Civil War right now. So you had boogie boys showing up at various events. You had Groups with names like the Flathead Patriot Guard, the Yellowstone Militia of Billings, which I've already talked about, people representing various chapters of 3% militia groups, and again, all kinds of what I'm calling self-styled patriots. People who may not have had a group affiliation, but they had all the gear and were just waiting for their call to show up. Now at these events, they started claiming they were asked to be there, that they were working with the organizers, they were working with the cops and other such claims. Let's be really clear, nobody asked them to be there. They were not asked by the organizers. Instead, the organizers ended up having to deal with them at these events to try to keep situations from blowing up and getting out of control. It's also important to remember these groups have no legitimate authority to be providing security. They are not authorized by federal, state, or local governments to do that. Instead, they are unaccountable groups of armed men who showed up at these rallies and claimed that role for themselves. They have not been asked by law enforcement to assume that role. One law officer I was talking to last week, I thought made a good point. He laughed and said, I mean, it's important for us to remember that these same people that claim they're working with us and for us these last couple weeks were threatening to arrest us during the pandemic and lockdown situations. So as we've been saying, it's incredibly dangerous to allow these militias to act like they are providing law enforcement services and to normalize their presence playing that role at community events. And I think one of the ways that I like to think about it is, do we want people representing a movement that has spawned the likes of Timothy McVeigh and the Bundy family to be the ones providing security at anything? And I think the answer to that is no. We developed this graphic with 3 things people can do when it comes to these militias showing up at Black Lives Matter's protests. So the first is contacting local officials and encouraging them to think about charging these groups under the state's law that criminalizes paramilitaries. And that state law was actually passed about 30 years ago in lieu of the militia movement's rising influence at that time. And again, it's important to remember, we're not talking about the individual right to carry here. What we're talking about are these unaccountable groups of armed men gathering and acting like, and in some cases, in some communities, really impersonating law enforcement. The second piece there is related to us hearing about incidents at Black Lives Matters rallies that aren't reported, that we try to follow up on and there aren't reports. And so we've encouraged people who experience or see threatening actions taken by these groups to make sure that those are reported to local law enforcement. And then the third is about calling on local public officials to publicly denounce the presence of these groups at community events and clearly say that they don't have the authority to operate like law enforcement. So with that, that probably wasn't as quick as I should have gone, but that's kind of an overview of the militia movement up through today, kind of a quick look from the 1990s forward. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sherilyn.
All right, so many little steps you have to do here. Thank you so much, Travis. So now that Travis has frightened us all about what's going on and in militia groups and so on, my part of the presentation is going to be about what's happening in what you can do in your communities in order to push back against the narratives and the misinformation and so on that's happening. I am going to see if I can share my screen now. And nope, I think Travis, you're going to have to put up the presentation and forward it. Sorry about the technical difficulties here. Okay, so my part of the presentation says smart strategies for managing extremists, developing proactive strategies for resilient communities. And this, this image that you're seeing right now is of the wonderful event that we had. Ammon Bundy and Matt Shea and some other extremists, anti-government people, anti-Indian extremists, and folks from the militia groups were had a conference up in Whitefish in the fall of 2018, and Love Lives Here and MHRN and some other organizations organized a peaceful event to bring the community together. And that's what we're going to be talking about here, is ways that you don't have to be afraid, you don't have to be just run around in panic and fear, that we can help communities come together and do positive things that create connections and community. Please go ahead, Travis. So this is what we're seeing right now in Kalispell. This photo was taken from the I Can't Breathe event, which was a Black Lives Matter protest on June 6th in Kalispell. As Travis said, the militia and patriot groups have been around for quite a while. What's frustrating is that we're dealing with the same situation in a different year, but the good news about that is that we understand how to deal with militia groups and their impact in communities. There's no special formula when it comes to dealing with these militia groups. I wish there was a magic wand or something like that that we could just wave and say, okay, this is how you deal with it, and they will magically go away. Unfortunately, that's not the case. But by understanding how they operate, we can help communities avoid some of the traps and the pitfalls that they have set up, in order to make sure that the attention is set on them and not on anyone else. So here's kind of the lay of the land here. Here's how it goes, is these militia group and patriot groups and white nationalists are looking for controversies, even small ones within the community, in order to create divisions. And in that controversy, they spread misinformation. That misinformation then creates division in communities. So it's the people who believe the truth and who are on the right side of the opinion, and then the other people. And as these groups start separating people into the good guys and the bad guys, of the you're with us and you're against us, then that tends to radicalize people into violence. A quick case study on that is when all of the fear and the information started coming out about COVID-19 pandemic and how bad it was going to be, we kind of warned people. We said, hey, this is hard. This situation is coming. People are going to be fearful. Please be aware that extremist groups jump into here and try to get a following that way. What happened then is, just a couple of weeks later, is Dr. Annie Bukacek had a video about COVID-19 and how the CDC, Centers for Disease Control, were manipulating information, lying to the American public. Doctors were falsifying death certificates. And suddenly we had this whole controversy about COVID-19 really wasn't that bad, and the government is lying to us to control us. And in that space, we saw a lot of increase in activity in the militia and patriot groups. They had been kind of quiet, and then all of a sudden everybody was talking about this, and how their constitutional rights were being taken away because of shelter-in-place laws, and as cities declared a state of emergency, there were protests and a lot of drama. Again, creating division between the people who were going to, as the patriot and militia group said, behave like sheep and obey the government, and those who were going to rise up and defend their constitutional rights. What we've been worried about in this whole thing is violence coming out of that, and there has been some at some of the protests. but that's a quick case study, and that's the playbook we're going, that they use, and knowing that helps all of us kind of see where they're headed, instead of just dwelling in panic when we see a bunch of guys walking around in tactical gear at a public event that should be a peaceful situation. Okay, Travis. So a lot of people, well, militia and patriot groups, again, are focused on, since they're anti-government, they're focused on their personal constitutional rights. And what they repeat over and over again in their groups and their messaging, both internal and public facing, is that people are trying to take their rights away. And one of those, of course, is the Second Amendment, their guns. People are trying to take their guns away. And so, but what we know is that the number one problem with militias is not that they have guns, is that they spread so much misinformation, which again ends up creating this division in communities and then incites people to violence. So here's an example of misinformation that was spread. We have a screenshot here from the Flathead County Republican Women. This was posted on Monday, June 15 or 16. I'm not looking at a calendar here. But anyway, what happened here was someone sent me a screenshot of this on Facebook and said, oh my gosh, Sherilyn, this is happening. Did you know what's going on with this? And you can see here that they've posted that out of the 90,000 residents in the Flathead Valley, 1,500 people have signed a petition to defund the Kalispell police. And that also, Love Lives Here was having a rally or a protest at Depot Park at 5 p.m. And we were going to be requesting the defunding of the police department. Well, none of that was true. Absolutely none of it. We didn't know anything about a petition. We didn't ask anyone to go to Depot Park. And in fact, we had an online webinar scheduled for that night at about the same time. And so the problem was, though, is that this message went out and it incited some people to go to Depot Park and have their own protest. You know, they have the freedom of speech, they can do that. But they were all set to face off against Love Lives Here, and, you know, perpetuate these ideas that we were against the police, we're against the military, we might harm the veterans monument that is there in Depot Park. And it was all completely nonsense, but it's creating division and animosity in our community. Let's go ahead, Travis. So again, this misinformation animosity leads to even more division. So these were some comments that came to me in a community Facebook group where they were discussing Love Lives Here. Again, someone sent me a screenshot and I dropped in. I explained to them, here's how Love Lives Here started, because of movies denying the Holocaust that were being shown in the local library. And this fine gentleman starts with insults. And then if you look down on the first one, it says, Montana is not, well, sorry, is not the state for you and your group. This isn't California, Oregon, or Washington. And so this is the division we're talking about, a disagreement over misinformation about what people are doing or believing suddenly turns into, we belong here and you don't. You know, racism is based on that same principle, but you can be identified by skin color or ethnic background or religion. But in this case now, what we're seeing with the militia and patriot groups is they're obsessed with who belongs to the community, who lives in state, and who doesn't. You can see here on the next one that he says, most of us do agree, and we agree that your poison will not be tolerated here. And so again, getting into these real divisions of you really don't belong. And that's very toxic because then if certain people think that they've deputized themselves to decide who belongs in a community and who doesn't, well, then what's the next logical step? Please go ahead, Travis. The next step is radicalization, and which leads to violence. So last week we got this lovely email to Love Lives Here, which says, of course, it's a totally bogus email address. But it says your movement is a joke. You do not want a discussion. You want to push your agenda and remove anyone whose opinion differs. You are a joke to the American way of life. People show up armed to your protest because they don't trust your ability to maintain a peaceful nature. Like it or not, we are here to stay and we outnumber you greatly. Keep pushing and you will find out the hard way eventually. So this email ended up going to the police and the FBI, but you can see the whole progression here is we're right, you're wrong. They're even questioning whether or not we believe in America, we're not peaceful, we outnumber you, so you should just go away and we will make that happen if you don't shut up. And so when you understand this progression, like we see this, we know where this is going. And I've had multiple conversations in the community after the rally that we had at on June 6th, the Black Lives Matter rally. And we've seen this progression a bunch of times. We know where this is going. And so what Love Lives Here is trying to do is steer away from those conflicts as much as possible. So combat the misinformation and refuse to get into the standoffs and the fights that these people want. Please go ahead, Travis. So one of those places that we are avoiding is a fight over the Second Amendment. As you saw in those emails and the messaging, they are just convinced that Love Lives Here and Montana Human Rights Network and Black Lives Matter are trying to take people's guns away, trying to take their Second Amendment rights away, and they're going to defund the police. One place that's been an extreme source of tension now in the Flathead Valley, and this picture just encapsulates the whole thing, is this is one of the people who showed up at the rally on June 6th. He's got the American flag, so he's claiming America. He's standing in front of the Veterans Memorial, which all of the patriot and militia groups spread the rumor that Antifa was coming to deface the Veterans Monument, and they had to be there to protect it. And you can see this guy's very prominent gun being displayed to indicate that he is protecting this monument and also that you're not going to take his gun away. And so because we know that they're having a fight over the Second Amendment, we don't talk about that in our messaging at all for Love Lives Here, because honestly, we know that open carry is the law. So what we talk about instead is we talk about the misinformation and the harm that that misinformation is doing in our community, not open carry, because we know that that's not really going to solve any problems or change. It's not going to have any positive results. In other words, they're trying to bring us over there so they can have a showdown, and that's just not something anyone's going to benefit to. It's just going to create a lot of division. We've seen that in northern Idaho and eastern Washington, and we are just not going to do that to the community. Can you go ahead, please, Travis? So what can you do? You know, you can refuse to engage in these debates when you know what their game is. What's also really powerful is to develop relationships. This is probably the most important thing that we learned from the troll storm during the winter of 2016 and 2017, is that the relationships that we had ahead of time were so important. The relationships that we forged during the crisis were also helpful, but it helps to have a bond of trust with people before you can go ahead and deal with really big threats to the peace in your community. So with Love Lives Here, we had good connections with the Jewish community because that's the community that's been attacked repeatedly in the Flathead Valley. One that we've had to build relationships with is the indigenous communities around the Flathead Valley. This photo is from a panel discussion that we had about missing and murdered Indigenous women in 2019, so last year. And you see the woman in the red t-shirt on the right, that's Brianna Lamb. She organized this whole thing. So basically, in order to learn more about missing and murdered Indigenous women, we said to Brianna Lamb, how do you think this should be best represented? How do you think this discussion should go? She put together a panel. She invited all these people. Love Lives Here took care of all the costs associated with this. We paid the panelists. And since then, there are several people in this photo. So we've got, if you're going from left to right, there's Marita Growing Thunder. We've got Ivy and Ivan McDonald. We've got Lauren Small Rodriguez. We've got Claire Charlo. Adele Brooke is in the, I don't have her last name, I'm sorry. She's in the way back. We have Tara Walker Lyons, Shelley Fyant, and then Brianna Lamb again. And some of these people we talk to occasionally. Some have become really important connections as we do work in Love Lives Here and strive to really center the needs of marginalized communities much better. Please go ahead. And then the last one, I mean, this is all hard work, building relationships and figuring out strategies. It's hard work because you're watching what these people are saying and you're trying to figure out how to respond effectively instead of reacting. And so throwing parties actually is an awesome way of bringing the community together and really giving people hope and good information and in your community. So the benefit of throwing parties is that you bring people together. When extremists come to town, whether they're white nationalists or militia members or anti-government, whatever, it's easy for people to sit behind their computers and get very frightened of what's happening and try to troubleshoot things, and it's just, it's really hard. And so when you can get people together in person, which has been harder with COVID-19, obviously, people stand around and look around and say, oh my gosh, I didn't realize there were so many of us. And we saw that with the Love Not Hate event that we had up here, and we saw it during this event that we had, the Montanans Undivided event that brought together public lands advocates as well as human rights advocates. And we invited Vernon Finley to come speak. We had Native American speakers, we had business owners, we had elected officials, we had public lands people, and it was just a time of hope and peace in the community. And it gives us a platform rather than speaking against something else. It gives us a chance to speak up for our community's values. What we always do, and this last point here is really important, is because we refuse to get into a standoff situation, we hold our events, like if there's something happening like this, This West is Our West conference that happened in Whitefish, we did not hold our event across the street from theirs. We held it like a mile or so away in another park so that, you know, we want everyone to be safe. And so that's community members, that's police officers. We want everyone to be safe. And so we have it in a separate location so police aren't having to manage a volatile situation. And it's really, that's really been wonderful. It's really been helpful, and it helps us live out our values as a human rights organization. Go ahead, Travis. And so those are the most powerful things that I can give you to kind of recap. You know, if you want to protect your community, understand this sort of cycle that the militia is coming from. When extremism comes to town, your panic level goes to 15, and it's hard to remember some of these core things, but do that and find ways to hold your community together through relationships and events that are very positive. If anything does go down in your community, you're not alone. Please remember that Montana Human Rights Network has been through this before. We've seen lots of different scenarios. And so we have ways to help you and And we have resources, we have connections, and we have ideas about things that have worked in the past. And so one of the things that you can also fill out to start this whole process, if you're not sure what to do, is contact us through our hate incident report form. And that's at mhrn.org. But also on our website is this rapid response guide that kind of steps you through some things that you can do. Now, you don't always have to do all 5 of these things. Sometimes saving evidence and calling the authorities is enough. Sometimes saving evidence and gathering support. You don't always have to throw a party. We love them, but you know. And we can help provide all that information for you. That's what I have. Travis, you can stop sharing screen so people can see me again.